Kristin, I would love to start off with you. It was a very basic question I posed to you a couple of minutes ago, which is just paint us a picture of what the automotive industry in North America looks like at the moment.
Well, it's a very different auto industry in the post-pandemic world. We have a issue of a lot of demand and an inability to supply that demand. The auto sales in North America have been strong, in US in particular. We had a surge in electric and electrified vehicles. Even in the pandemic year, sales last year were down about 15%, but electrified, that would include hybrid, plug-in, and battery electric, up almost 5.5%. We're seeing that same surge in battery electric and hybrid and plug-in hybrids this year, but the dealer lots are empty and a lot of plants are shut down. We've lost about 1.4 million units of production in the US and 2.3 million in North America overall. And semiconductors are the headline, but there's a lot of other shortages below that, from commodities and things like carbon black, even just a whole wide range of supply chain crimps that are making it difficult to meet that demand.
That's a very familiar picture that I think we've all got used to seeing in the last few weeks and months. I'd love to hear the perspective from Jaguar Land Rover, Chris. Just talk to us about how important that North American market is for you.
Oh, it's hugely important. The U.S. market is the single largest market from an export standpoint for Jaguar Land Rover, and it has been that way for the last several years. And if you add Canada into it, North America just it amplifies that it's the largest market from an export standpoint. So look, we see it as integral and core to our future growth as a business. We've launched a strategy we call Reimagine, which we launched in February of this year, where we're basically looking at the electrified world moving forward and have made some strong commitments to what we're going to do. And the U.S. is a big part of that. We have said that the Jaguar brand is going to go all electric from 2025. Land Rover is going to have its first electric vehicle from 2024, and we expect 60% thereabout of Land Rover sales to be all electric by 2030, and then we go zero net carbon 2039. Now those are global figures, but obviously the U.S. and North America in totality plays a huge part of getting there. It's going to be challenging. There's no doubt about it. We need some public policies to help support that growth, whether it's EV infrastructure, whether it's some federal tax incentives, you name it, across the board. There are things that are going to be required from the, as I said, the public policy space to help us grow that business in North America.
And Chris, if you had to pick your, top three things that you really need policymakers to help you hit those targets, what would they be? Your gold, silver, bronze.
Yeah, well, gold probably is EV infrastructure, but it might be tied at the podium with EV incentives right now. And there's discussions going on with the reconciliation bills in Washington about federal tax incentives. These are for consumer incentives. And right now, we need the market to grow. And what we've seen across the board are the federal tax EV incentives for consumers are really that thing that helps grow the market. Because there's some very early adopters in the EV space, but we need more adopters. And candidly, if those incentives aren't there, that's going to make it a bit more challenging. But the infrastructure, it's not dissimilar to other markets around the world. We need to be able to have that convenient charging. We need it both in heavily populated areas. We obviously need it in areas where less populated, but where people may travel to. So those are sort of the biggest 8 items that we see. And I guess third, candidly, is some of around the EV incentives. Not putting stipulations around those about, right now there's some labor value content and U.S. labor content issues that we're dealing with. But those are kind of where we are. We do also then see, what do the states and the provinces do in terms of from their policy standpoint to help grow the market. And again, having access to some funding would help the entire industry.
Absolutely. This isn't just a federal issue at all. Kristin, it's obviously been 1 year since the USMCA took effect. Looking back on that year, what difference has it made? What for the better, for the worse? How's it been over the last year?
Well, I mean, it's very difficult to say what additive effect the USMCA has had on top of every other thing that's changing in this industry. We're making new products and new processes with a whole lot of investment coming into North America and the United States in particular. And to distinguish that from the USMCA effects is very difficult to tear apart. But USMCA went into effect in July 2020. There's been a period of informed compliance where companies are doing their best to comply, and it seems to be going fairly well. But that localization of the supply chain around electric vehicles is kind of overarching on top of that. So that's why we're seeing a lot more investment, primarily in the United States and Canada, around batteries, around all of the electric motors and e-transaxles and new models, and in fact, new plants that we just heard about a couple of weeks ago from Ford here in the United States. So it's, there are much more stringent requirements for trade within the North American region. Interesting that, Canada and Mexico are also part of the Cptpp. And they can trade with each other through that if they choose. And the U.S. is not. The U.S. pulled out, and I don't know that there's a pathway for them to get back in. But USMCA seems to be going okay so far.
Well, sticking with USMCA for the moment, Johann, how's it been for Mexico?
It's definitely been an interesting experience since USMCA came into force. To give you a bit of context, I would probably start flagging 3 of the core objectives of USMCA and what does it actually mean in reality to better understand how it's going for Mexico. For one, and obviously with a huge political connotation, which is to rebalance trade in the region. Second, to increase FDI attraction to North America. And thirdly, to modernize the relationship, since NAFTA was done a huge time ago, and some of the modern trade clauses were not really included in this agreement. But I completely agree with what Kristin was saying. So it's really difficult to say if what we have seen in the Mexican auto industry has been the result of COVID-19 or has been actually the result of USMCA being implemented last year.
Well, that's very interesting. So if we try to differentiate what was COVID, what was USMCA, what were other things, how do you think the USMCA has affected employability or movement of people and movement of product?
So there definitely is an angle on USMCA on employment of people, particularly because of its labor provision, and how it sort of became one of the key elements of the discussion, one of the main points of attention for both the US and the Canadian government with the Mexican government. However, again, I will go back to the point about the restrictions on movement of people. I would say that have been closer to the COVID-19 rather than USMCA implementation. However, there's definitely some impact on how things have been done, particularly if we looked at the new and updated rules of origin provisions in the agreement. On one hand, companies will have to comply with a 75% regional content rule. Added to that, a 70% use of steel and aluminum in their products, and added to that a labor rule of origin implying that 40% of the car has to be done in a high salary zone, meaning that workers have to be paid $16 per hour. So obviously there are implications for companies with this, because it's not easy to comply with the rule of origin of 75%. We've been hearing from some of our partners that the engine by itself represents around 25% of the car. So if you're not producing that in the region, you're basically left out of the possibility of using USMCA as a means to trade in North America freely. So if we look at it, the rule of origin by itself, more than a way to incentivize regional production, is an incentive to attract foreign direct investments and have companies invest in North America so they can continue trading under the terms and clauses of USMCA. This rule of origin is not being implemented and is not being applied at 75% from day one. The 3 governments agreed on a staged implementation of it, meaning that they are are envisioning to start using this rule of origin of 75% by 2023. Right now, if I'm not mistaken, it's at 69%. But yeah, they're doing their best to make it easy for companies to comply it, even though, as I said, it's quite restrictive in a sense.
And Johann, just sticking with that, how does that impact bilateral relationships, and what are the implications for companies who haven't got a base in the region, do you think?
So probably like the biggest one is if companies, if UK companies want to like really use one of the main things about Mexico is that it's an amazing gateway to trade with the US, but the possibility of using USMCA is quite limited to investing in the region and sourcing your products still particularly from local producers. So the immediate implication would be to think about investing in the region to be able to use the rule of origin if the target market is the US. In the case of Mexico and Canada, as you know, we already have the trade continuity agreement for both countries, and we were looking to start negotiations with both countries at some point over this year or at the beginning of the next.
If I can bring things a little closer to home for me anyway, talking about that, you know, the holy grail for us of the US-UK trade deal, no great sign of it coming. What would your predictions be?
That's an interesting question as well. I think, I mean, and probably like this comes down from everything that we've heard about President Biden sort of downplaying the possibility of having an agreement with the US and the intention that there is. But and this speaking as a member of DIT, I can say that the objective remains to reach an agreement with the US at some point. It was one of the first things that was discussed when the UK first left the EU, and that remains a priority. Again, and bringing this together as well, we've been hearing a lot about the UK joining USMCA. It's slightly difficult to like think of that because USMCA is a regional agreement and the possibility it doesn't even have like an accession clause. But with the fact that we have three processes in parallel running, Canada, Mexico, and the US, I would imagine that that's going to be the end state of it, having three bilateral trade agreements.
And Kristin, what about the chance of a bilateral deal, the US-UK deal? How are you viewing that at the moment?
Similarly pessimistic, I believe. You know, the Biden administration's trade priority seems to be enforcement of USMCA, and they've put a lot of effort into enforcing particularly the labor clauses with Mexico and China. China is number one on the trade agenda and the major focus of this administration's outward trade policy, even to the effect that it overshadows the Trade and Technology Committee meetings last week or a week or so ago with the EU. China is the elephant in the room for trade policy.
And Chris, this pessimism that Kristin was voicing there, that many of us here in the UK are feeling about the chances of that deal, that US-UK deal, how does that impact you and your business?
You know, right now, status quo is actually, it's okay for us. So no, don't get me wrong, that duties do have a cost, obviously, to the business, but it's a different environment than when it was the Trump administration, and there were threats of Section 232 tariffs, which had some high potential duty rates, and that was really putting pressure in the need to do a deal. That doesn't exist anymore. So, you know, for us, it's, you know, we're managing the duty rate coming into the U.S. inbound is reasonable, I guess I would say, as a MFN rate. You know, if we think about future bilateral deals, you know, there's always challenges to it. Obviously, you know, we like free and fair trade, but it comes down to how they handle some of the rules of origin and other, you know, regional value content, especially for a company like ours that's been really integrated into the EU from a supply chain standpoint. So it's interesting to watch, but I share the pessimism. I just don't see any movement on this, and for us, it's you know, we're more focused, frankly, on Canada and Mexico at this point because of some of the challenges we face with those potentially.
Okay, well, Kristin took with one hand and you gave back. Kristin said she was pessimistic, but you're saying, yes, you're pessimistic too, but you don't think it's actually going to have such a bad impact. So I guess that's perhaps more than we could have asked for. Johann, I want to go back to the deal that you mentioned, and I know you were personally involved in the UK-Mexico deal. How would you analyse the impact of that deal? Obviously, it was great to get it, but what difference has it actually made, do you think?
So again, and to be a bit of context, the trade continuity agreement with Mexico was defined as a tool to ensure that there was as little disruption to bilateral trade as possible, because after the UK left the EU, obviously the possibility of using the global EU-Mexico agreement as the preferential mechanism for trading with Mexico was no longer a possibility. In this sense, we try to use the trade continuity agreement as a means to replicate the relationship with all the caveats around it, with a couple of caveats around it, to make sure that it also applied on a bilateral basis for UK-Mexico trade. If I'm not mistaken, the Mexico TCA was one of the last agreements that HMG secured at the end of last year, and since the agreement sort of like wasn't going to be ready to be in force on day one, we sort of agreed on a bridging mechanism with Mexico to ensure that UK companies would be able to use what we call the tariff rebate mechanism, in which any tariffs that they paid from January until June, which was the day when the agreement entered into force, would have the possibility of being reimbursed. Obviously, I mean, while the continuity approach looked at replicating conditions, there were specific caveats and specific considerations that we needed to have to make sure that we were really making sure that the end state would reflect the needs and requirements of the automotive industry on one hand, and of every sector from the UK from a trade perspective. Particularly in this sense, we implemented a clause of EU accumulation, meaning that even though the UK is no longer part of the European Union, UK companies would still be able to use their production chains based in Europe to meet the rule of origin threshold that's established in the text and remain doing business as usual. However, and probably like a paid ad for my team, if any company present here in this session has had any issue trading with Mexico, me and my team would be more than interested to hear about it. So please get in touch with TH in Mexico, and we will make sure to support you in this sense.
Great, thank you very much for that. We'll make sure that participants are aware of that. Now, in the last session, we were hearing a lot about how out of date a lot of trade deals are because of the way technology has moved, and those trade agreements are stuck in the old days, and technology's moved. Obviously, this is something that has a big impact on the automotive industry with all the technological advancements that have happened for this sector. So I just wondered, coming back to, obviously this is a new deal, but it's based on an old deal that is actually 2 decades old, whether that needs to be brought up to date into the modern world.
Yeah, definitely. And probably, one of the clauses from the trade continuity agreement with Mexico that I'm more personally excited about is the clause where both sides commit to start a new negotiation of a bilateral agreement to modernize the relationship and include some of the modern worlds and modern trade policy disciplines in it. So as you know, and this is a result of a couple of different things. So on one hand, the EU and Mexico finished the negotiations of the modernized EU-Mexico agreement last year, if I'm not mistaken. Although that agreement's not in force yet, if we look at it and what would have happened if EU companies suddenly start having better access than UK companies to the Mexican market, UK companies would be at a disadvantage. So the ambition with this is to make sure that we reach at least the same provisions that the EU obtained, but with a particular focus on what's important for UK companies. This clause to negotiate a free trade agreement is linked to a review clause on the trade continuity agreement, and if I may call it like this, possibly a deadline to finish the upcoming negotiations as well, in which we, from the moment the trade continuity agreement entered into force, we have 3 years to finish the negotiation of the upgraded agreement with Mexico. So as you know, trade policy and agreements as a whole usually take a long time to be negotiated. So we hope that via the inclusion of this clause, we can have something that UK companies can use in the short to midterm. We finalized our call for input, and in which we held a couple of sessions even with UK companies in Mexico to sort of understand their needs. And now we're in the process of building our mandate towards a negotiation. We expect to launch them either at the end of this year or at the start of the next, depending on how this mandate process goes. But again, we're going to do our best to make sure this agreement reflects the modern needs of the UK industry and allows UK companies to compete on level ground with companies all over the world.
Good to know. Kristin, you sounded like you wanted to come in.
Oh, no. One of the things I was going to point out is that, the United States has free trade agreements with many countries around the world, but still can only reach about 17% of the global market for new vehicles from our shores. Canada and Mexico have free trade agreements around the world, including the trade continuation agreements, that can reach over 50% of the market for new vehicles from their shores. So we are in a very different situation in the US versus Canada and Mexico with their free trade reach. But, the US is the big market here in North America, so maybe it's not as important for us to reach beyond our shores.
Swings and roundabouts. Chris, I just want to ask you, Johann said a few minutes ago, if anybody has had different experiences trading with Mexico, or particularly had any problems trading with Mexico, to get in touch with him. And I just wonder what your experience has been like trading with Mexico.
I think, in general terms, it's been good. However, when Brexit happened, for vehicles, we have factories in the UK and we have factories in the EU that export into Mexico. The issue that we've had is that the UK content for EU produced vehicles now doesn't count. And therefore, we've had some duty rate changes going into the market. Similarly for Canada, so we have those two issues that we are struggling with now. As we look forward to newer agreements, as Johann said, we'd like to see where the EU content fits into the UK produced vehicles as we move forward, because it's obviously as I said earlier, our supply chains are really integrated between the two markets, and it's been a challenge as we look forward, and not just from our standpoint. We generally know where things come from, but we have, let's call it tier 2, tier 3 suppliers, where it's to try to understand where those components really originate from can be a challenge. So those are the things that we are going to have to really focus on as we look at to both Canada and Mexico. And and I know this is a Johann's area because it's Canada. One of the challenges we have in Canada, frankly, is there's a luxury tax that they've put forth, which is sort of a non-tariff barrier, which really impacts EU and UK produced vehicles coming into Canada. That looks like it's going forward from a standpoint of adding some taxation onto it. And that is one of those things that obviously concerns us as well, given some of the price points that we play in the market.
Yeah, very interesting, that luxury tax and how it might impact organisations like your own. Kristin, I want to take our attention away from just North America, Mexico and Canada. Obviously, Mexico and Canada are both parties to the Cptpp. It's been mentioned many, many times today. Potentially, the UK might be joining too, might be a party soon. Will the US apply to join the Cptpp, do you think?
I think it would be very difficult for this president to rejoin the Cptpp. As you may know, the previous president withdrew on the first day of his administration, and this president has been one of the most pro-union presidents that I've ever seen in my lifetime, and the unions do oppose joining the Cptpp. So it would be very politically challenging for him to join back into Cptpp. Plus, the rules are set. The U.S. Rejoining Cptpp would be with the rules that exist. It would be very difficult for them to muscle in and really change the terms of that agreement. So I think it would be very challenging in the next few years.
And Johann, what's Mexico's attitude to the US rejoining Cptpp?
So Mexico is definitely keen on the US rejoining Cptpp. I think when the agreement was really originally negotiated, most of the provisions were done with having the US in mind to make sure like some of the standards would be applicable not only to the countries that are now part of the agreement, but also to the US. So Mexico is definitely keen on having the US back in the group, and probably, I mean, as reference, when Mexico first heard about the discussions of TPP regionally, and they saw that the US and Canada were going to be part of it, they said that they couldn't be left behind, and they couldn't be left out of this group. So the US being in the group, in the bloc, was one of the huge reasons what they decided to join. But at the end of the day, when the US left the agreement under the last administration, Mexico remained one of the defenders of the text, and tried to like bring all the countries together to make sure that the agreement didn't end up being forgotten because the US had left it.
But you know, the rule of origin in Cptpp for autos is 50%, not 75. So it really does sort of gut the USMCA to rejoin the Cptpp.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to bring some questions in to this session because we've got about 10 minutes left until the end of our final panel. Let's go to a question. This is for you, Chris. This is from Fergal Harrington Beatty, and Fergal says, what factors are JLR considering when selecting a US cell manufacturing partner? So what factors are you considering? And if so, would their preference be a JV or another collaboration model? Chris?
I'll be perfectly honest with you. I'm not sure I can answer that question specifically. What our strategy team is doing, as I alluded to earlier, you know, we launched Reimagine strategy in February of this year. So there's a lot of work behind the scenes in terms of what it's going to take to deliver the strategy. And I will candidly say I'm not the person to understand what the agreements and or discussions are in cell manufacturing at this point.
Is fair enough. If you can't answer it, you can't answer it. We've got a question from Adam Breeze, UK representative to the state of Tennessee. Hello to Adam. Adam says, following the record-breaking EV investments of Ford, GM, VW and Nissan in Tennessee, what does the panel think are the key opportunities for UK companies in the US supply chains? So why don't we go to Kristin for that?
Certainly. You know, the Biden administration has set a soft target of 50% of the market in the US to be electric vehicles. Canada is similarly aligned on the EV front. And of course, there's California and all the states that follow California that are going to completely no petrol vehicles at all after a certain date. So there's a lot of opportunity, I think, in the United States for those suppliers who are into the supply chain for electric vehicles. The geography here, you know, we're actually seeing a widening of the geography. So all the cell plants and the investments are coming to the US. They're not necessarily right next to the assembly plant where they're going to be supplying. So the Ford investment in Tennessee is a little different, that there's a cell plant and an assembly plant right together. But GM will be supplying cells from Ohio to plants in Michigan and beyond. And we're seeing that distance expand. So while we're not getting imported cells, they're coming from about 1,700 miles away to the battery plant to the assembly plants at this point. So it's a big country, and there's a lot of states that are vying for those investments right now. We're seeing investments in Arizona from some of the new startup companies, from Texas, certainly in California. Illinois just landed a electric bus company a few months ago. So all of the states are very aggressively pursuing a stakehold in the electric vehicle future.
That's it. And Kristin, just thinking more about European and transatlantic trade relations rather than interstate relations, building some sort of new alliance. We're talking about things like the end to threats to automotive, the beginning of a coordinated approach, people saying, maybe there could be a coordinated approach on WTO reform, on supply chains, on raw materials. Do you see that happening? Do you see there being agreement, a transatlantic agreement to push for those reforms?
I think absolutely. The Biden administration did release in June a whole set of supply chain reports. They've gotten much more on board with industrial policy than previous administrations have been. And I know that those directions align with many of the directions in the UK and the EU around critical minerals supply chain, battery supply chain, and it really does come all back to China again, I believe. China is the largest producer of electric vehicle batteries. One of my colleagues was talking to someone in China about our electric vehicle and battery investments here in the US, and they said, oh, it's so cute, you have a few gigafactories. I can look out my window and see 6 gigafactories from where I sit. So it's really that, getting the world behind building up an industrial policy around EVs that counters China.
Very interesting on that issue, actually. We've just had a question come in. For North America, this questioner says, where is the global trade balance sitting? Is there more interest in Asia, as you've just mentioned, Kristin, or is Europe, including the UK, still a key area for focus? Kristin, why don't you kick that off, and then I'll ask Chris the same question.
I think that the EU and the UK remain very important trading partners and allies. And I don't know if you've seen the recent brilliant piece by Sumaya Keynes in The Economist about the shift of trade from being about trade and economies to being about national security and environment and labor standards, and bringing in all of these things that were auxiliary agreements to being the core of why we're doing trade. And I think that this is all part of an alignment of the world order around those critical strategic national security and environmental and labor standards issues.
Chris, would you agree with Kristin there?
Yeah, I would agree wholeheartedly, but I would also add to it. I think it's still as important as China is from a sales standpoint. It's hugely important for any automaker. I think the U.S. still remains a place where trends are set, and I think you've got to see what if you think about bringing vehicles to market, there's still that dynamic of the U.S. market helping to set the stage for whatever it might be moving forward. Now, we may be slightly behind what China has done from an EV investment standpoint, but almost to Kristin's point earlier, there's money going into the market, and there are things that will help drive it forward. And I still think that I'm bullish on the U.S. market. Have been. We've had our ups and downs, but I think it's looking very positive moving forward for the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, for that matter.
In fact, I'm just going to throw another question at you, Chris, which is very much related. So this one's just come in 2 seconds ago, saying, are there concerns among North American automakers about the pace of the European transition to electric vehicles and their ability to supply suitable product for the market? So do you think there is concern about that?
Yeah, I guess you'd say there's just general concern, kind of going back to my earlier points about, the governments are moving faster than the market is developing. So I think that would just be a general kind of concern across the board. And I know I'm familiar enough with what some of the EU directives are and specific markets within the EU. Similarly to Kristin mentioned, California is pushing forward very fast, and is the market developing quick enough? We're all committing resources. We say in automakers doing business in the US that there's roughly $330 billion worth of investments into future product plans. And will that pay off? Those are the big questions out there. We're all moving forward because we know it's the right thing to do, and we've got our commitments. But we need support, as I said earlier, from a policy standpoint to get there, regardless of the market.
And I think there's really 3 things that need to come together for consumers to get on board and to get to where the policy can support. The first is that there has to be price parity, and consumer incentives are aiming at that. The U.S. consumer incentive that's being proposed tops out at $12,500. That is for a U.S.-built, union-built vehicle with U.S. batteries. And then the second is utility parity, so that somebody who wants an electric vehicle isn't in a tiny little car. They can fit there, because the majority of vehicles sold, almost half of vehicles sold in the U.S. are cross utilities. So we have to electrify cross utilities and pickup trucks in order for Americans to get on board. And third is convenience parity, and that comes down to fast charging and batteries that can charge quickly. And there is an investment in the bipartisan infrastructure bill that is being considered for $7.5 billion on fast charging. A number of states are on board with charging networks and incentives, as well as some of the automakers themselves. I mean, of course, Tesla has their own charging network, but Ford and General Motors have committed to helping to build out the charging networks as well. So all of those parities, price, utility, and convenience, have to be lined up for consumers to really get to that 50% goal or the zero petrol vehicle future that is being envisioned.
Johann, I just have a couple of seconds left to give you the final word. Would you agree with what Kristin and Chris have both been saying, that whilst there is policymakers have ambitions, the market needs to be helped to catch up with those ambitions?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, it's not a simple thing to do, or a simple matter to suddenly decide that you want to like change your production chain to what the policy is asking. But there are obviously some cases where policy doesn't go as fast either, and probably like thinking from like a perspective of Mexico, right? We have seen in the past years that there's been like some developments about there being like massive amounts of lithium in the northern state of Sonora in Mexico, and there's still not enough clarity of like what the Mexican government wants to do with that. Although that is an opportunity right now to sort of like jump into the production chain of electric vehicles in the region, there's not enough clarity to do that. However, companies are already like starting to ask, what does that mean? How is the government going to manage that? And what is the ambition to that? But yeah, I think, and also like from the perspective of the Mexican government, they're also looking at facilitating the trade of electric vehicles and facilitating and making sure that that producer doesn't have to pay tariffs, for example, for their inputs in the region. So they last year slashed all the tariffs in those sort of products. While in reality, you sort of like see two different things happening. On one side, you see the Mexican government taking baby steps to make sure that they can be linked up to like the market trends, and on the other, a lack of policy development. So I wouldn't be able to say if at least from the Mexican market, the trends are going faster than the policy, or the policy is going faster than the trends.
Okay, well, we'll have to leave it there. But thank you so much for that really interesting discussion on all things automotive in North America. Thank you to Chris, Kristin and Johann.